Dear YouTube, in case you are investigating this video due to a complaint about hate speech or copyright violation, allow me to give the following assurances. Firstly, a word on copyright. If the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania is unhappy because I've used their propaganda in a way they disapprove of, please know that I am very familiar with copyright law and have ensured that any use of copyrighted material in this video falls within the fair use provisions, particularly as pertain to criticism and parody. Secondly, let me ease any concerns you may have about hate speech. Though I am unapologetically a critic of the leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses, I feel no hatred whatsoever when it comes to individual believers. I have even spoken out on occasion against the harassment and mistreatment of witnesses. Rather than being hateful, this video, and indeed my channel, represents my attempt at respectfully offering a helpful resource for witnesses who are beginning to think of their faith as false or harmful and would like to know the other side of the argument. Hello viewers, and welcome to my rebuttal of the September 2018 episode of JW Broadcasting. This month's episode is hosted by governing body helper Ken Flodin. Yes, the same Ken Flodin who dispensed these pearls of wisdom in the February 2016 episode.
Yes, Jehovah sees what we are on the inside, and he knows exactly the status of our relationship with him. The sin of Adam tainted our pure relationship with Jehovah. What I'm holding represents poison. And when the Pharisees denied an outright manifestation of the Holy Spirit, it was as if they rejected Jehovah himself. That one's relationship with Jehovah has been forever ruined. Jehovah discards the person like a piece of garbage. Grieving the Spirit might be likened to putting on more layers of garlic powder. This does not immediately damage our relationship with Jehovah, but if we continue to veer away from the leading of God's Spirit, we sadden him. We grieve the Spirit.
So, now that your appetites are suitably whetted, all that remains is to roll the first clip.
My name is Cecil Joseph Goff. I began to lose eyesight in the 70s. I can't see to read anything. I see only peripheral vision. I was playing in a country band at a very young age. Well, I played the tenor banjo, tenor guitar, and I played the mandolin. It was my life. And yet, when I began reading and studying, really, I wanted to stick with that, and I left the band.
We're literally moments into this JW Broadcasting episode, and already we've learned that it's not acceptable to pursue a career as a professional banjo player if you want to take your beliefs as a Jehovah's Witness seriously.
I and another brother was stopped as we were holding the phonograph up, and I was playing it for a lady at the door. Why, here about 15 or 20 men surrounded me. I asked him, how did you enjoy it? And he says, that's not the question. My question is, do you salute the flag? And I said, let me explain. He said, I don't want an explanation. I just want to know yes or no. Do you or do you not? I says, I do not. He threw me up in the air. I fell on my back in the street there, and then about 3 of them got on top of me, says, you're going to salute the flag or eat it. Bring me that flag over there. I was praying to Jehovah to remember me in the resurrection. About that time, several women run out of the houses on both sides of us and let those men alone. They didn't bother you. Let them alone. Let them go. So they got off of me and they left us like a bunch of beaten kittens.
A bunch of beaten kittens who were put in their place by responsible citizens who came to Brother Goff's rescue, and yet these particular worldly people would have been liable for destruction at Armageddon, despite their kindness and compassion, if Armageddon had come in that particular part of the 20th century and they had failed to become Jehovah's Witnesses.
Brother Norris said you got back just in time to get back on the linotype machine and set up a new book we have in Spanish. So I did that. I got on the linotype. And then Brother Norris told me, says, in 1964, we're going to have a 10-month course in Gilead for all branch people who had branch experience. Oh, it was very, very good.
So, in case any Jehovah's Witnesses are watching this, it's interesting to know that you now have permission to read Crisis of Conscience by Raymond Franz. Why? Because Raymond Franz has just made an appearance in this very JW Broadcasting episode in the 1964 Gilead photograph. Obviously, this isn't necessarily an endorsement of his books by Watchtower, but even so, I like to think of it as a sign. After all, why would Jehovah destroy you for reading Crisis of Conscience when its author has been shown in a JW Broadcasting episode? Something to think about.
Above everything else, our love for Jehovah should continue to grow. He knows our thoughts, our mind, our heart. He goes far beyond what man can do. And whatever his decision is, I've learned to understand it's the best decision. I have learned that if we obey what the organization says, what the Bible says, then we're doing Jehovah's will, and that's my concern. No regret whatsoever. None. Maybe I could have done more at times, but I'm certainly glad that I have taken advantage of it as much as I have up till now. And it's been a happy life. And I have seen Jehovah's hand time and again.
Brother Goff has led a full, happy life in theocratic service. But do you wonder how he was able to persevere for so many years and through so many different assignments? Cecil learned the value of letting Jehovah and his organization shape his thinking.
Yes, it's all about letting Jehovah and his organization shape your thinking. Not that this is brainwashing or anything. When they're talking about having your thinking shaped, they mean having your thinking shaped in a good way. Seriously, what better way to demonstrate the amount of control that Watchtower has over Jehovah's Witnesses? Right in the first segment, you have this story of Cecil Goff, who he says he's led a full life. Well, it's definitely full. He's spent his whole life in this religion. And of course, he's going to say that it was the best thing he's done and he has no regrets. He doesn't have any alternative by which he can measure his life. He's been indoctrinated to think that that's the only way you can live if you want to survive Armageddon. But here he is in the twilight of his life, and all of his life has been used up serving Watchtower.
In describing godly wisdom, the ancient man Job recognized it as priceless. At Job 28:17, he said, "Gold and glass cannot be compared to it." Glass has been around for centuries, even back in Job's day. However, what revolutionized glass production was the invention of glass blowing. By blowing through a hollow tube, a glass blower can quickly mold superheated molded glass into a specific shape. Satan's system has developed the art of shaping the minds of people into fragile glass vessels with little useful purpose.
So straight away we're into the nitty-gritty of what Ken Flodin wants to tell us about. He is concerned about Satan's system shaping the minds of people, because as we all know, there's only one organization on earth that gets to shape people's minds, and that's Watchtower.
In fact, Romans 9:22 refers to such ones as vessels of wrath made fit for destruction.
Now this is interesting. Ken Flodin has just pulled a subtle trick here. He's launching into this convoluted illustration about glass and vessels fit for destruction based on a verse in Romans chapter 9. It's interesting that as Ken Flodin is speaking, he's quoting scripture after scripture, and usually he will show the verse on the screen, which is typical for these talks. As the speaker is talking, the verse will show up on the screen. He's just quoted from Romans 9 verse 22 without reading from it on the screen, and there's a reason for that. If you actually go to Romans 9 verse 22, it's part of a sentence, it's part of a stream of dialogue. And if you just take Romans 9:22 on its own, it doesn't make a great deal of sense. You're instantly thinking, well, what's been said leading up to this? So Romans 9, let me read to you the whole section in context. Romans 9 verse 20, but who are you, O man, to be answering back to God? Does the thing moulded say to its moulder, why did you make me this way? What, does not the potter have authority over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for an honourable use, another for a dishonourable use? And then verse 22, and again, try to imagine this just on the screen by itself. It wouldn't read very well. What then if God had the will to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, and he tolerated with much patience vessels of wrath made fit for destruction? Now, the reason why Ken Flodin has not shown that verse on the screen is not just because it reads badly without its context. It's because the context negates the entire premise of the illustration he's about to launch into. So he's trying to persuade his audience that they need to be careful about Satan's system, because Satan's system is creating vessels of wrath made fit for destruction. It's Satan's system that's doing that. But what's interesting is that when you read this verse and it talks about vessels of wrath made fit for destruction, guess who the verse says does the creating? It's God. Immediately, it's saying there in verse 20, does the thing moulded say to its moulder, why did you make me this way? What, does not the potter have authority over the clay? It's a conversation, or a hypothetical conversation between creation and the creator. And I've actually referred to this verse before in Romans 9. It talks earlier on about how God hated Esau while Esau was still in the womb. Esau hadn't been born yet, and God had decided that he hated him, which is basically predestination. You're born evil. You're born as a vessel of wrath made fit for destruction, or you're born as a vessel for an honourable use. You're one of the ones that God chooses to not be destroyed. But again, it's just fascinating to see the sleight of hand there. There's a reason why Ken Flodin didn't show the full verse in context, because the context would have revealed that the illustration that's about to follow is disingenuous. It's not what the Bible's talking about. The Bible does not describe Satan creating vessels of wrath made fit for destruction. The Bible clearly describes God creating people evil, creating people ready to be destroyed, which is an unpleasant thought if you are a believer in the Bible and you believe in a God of love, but nevertheless, that's what Romans 9 is talking about.
Find with me Romans 12:2. What is responsible for molding and shaping the inclinations of the people of the world? Romans 12:2. And stop being molded by this system of things, but be transformed by making your mind over, so that you may prove to yourselves the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. To counteract being molded, the verse said, but be transformed by making your mind over. So the molding of this system is related to our thinking. the shaping of our minds.
And again, the only ones who get to shape people's minds are Watchtower or the governing body. But I hope you notice what Ken Flodin is doing here. He's already kind of breezed past Romans 9 without showing the audience the full context. He now immediately leaps to Romans 12, which talks about stop being molded by this system of things. So Paul is referring in one verse to Jehovah molding people as either evil or good. Again, that's an uncomfortable thought if you believe in a God of love, but nevertheless, that's what Romans 9 is talking about. And then a few chapters later, Paul is talking about a different kind of molding. In other words, the molding of people by this system of things. It's two completely different narratives. But with a sleight of hand, Ken Flodin is trying to convince people that they're talking about more or less the same thing.
Well, what evil air is blown down the hollow tube?
I'm sure there's scope for some toilet humor there.
It's identified quite clearly for us at Ephesians 2, 2 and 3, in which you at one time walked according to the system of things of this world, according to the ruler of the authority of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. The verse makes clear that this system of things has a ruler. Satan is called the ruler of the authority of the air. The verse indicates that the air is the spirit of the world.
And the reason why Ken Flodin is going to great pains to talk about this evil air that gets blown down a hollow tube is because he's setting us up for this convoluted illustration involving glass blowing. So he's basically plucking Bible verses from different parts of the New Testament to try and support various aspects of this illustration that he's thought of.
Well, with such a mindset, what kind of behavior does the thinking of the world lead to? Verse 3, yes, among them we all at one time conducted ourselves in harmony with the desires of our flesh, carrying out the will of the flesh and of our thoughts. And we were naturally children of wrath, just as the rest. For this reason they become vessels of wrath, made fit for destruction.
Another sleight of hand there, which I hope you've noticed. So Ken Flodin is basing this entire illustration again on Romans 9 verse 22, which doesn't describe Satan creating vessels of wrath made fit for destruction. It describes Jehovah creating people either as good or as vessels of wrath made fit for destruction. But to try and ignore all that and try to make his illustration that he's thought up make sense, he's literally found another verse in the New Testament, in a different book of the New Testament, in Ephesians, that mentions the word wrath. And he's literally making the argument that because the word wrath is used both in Romans 9 and in Ephesians chapter 2, therefore his illustration applies. This is quite simply juvenile reasoning.
Glassblowers often work in groups known as shops. An apprentice dips a hollow blowpipe into the liquid glass. By twirling it, he gathers a blob of molten glass. He shapes the blob by rolling it on a smooth surface called a marver. He then passes the tube to the gaffer or shop master. He blows air into the tube and fashions the glass into a globe. Well, if a wine glass is being made, the tube is then passed to the stem maker, and another gather of glass is attached. It's then shaped by means of long pointed tongs to form the stem. Then another gather of hot glass is added to the stem. The craftsman rolls the tube on the arm of his chair. He forms the base of the glass. We will briefly consider 4 ways that this system subtly tries to shape our mind into Satan's designs.
I can't help but feel a little bit sorry for Ken Flodin. It's obvious to me or it will become hopefully obvious to you if you've not seen this before as his illustration unfolds. But it's obvious to me that he is woefully inept as a teacher, and I'm frankly astonished that he's actually part of the governing body's teaching committee, despite being clearly inadequate in this department. We already saw in the February 2016 JW Broadcasting episode him concoct this ridiculously convoluted visual demonstration involving bread and garlic powder to illustrate sin.
We grieve the Spirit.
One of the most funny pieces of theatre I think I've ever seen in the JW Broadcasting studio. And you couldn't help but feel sorry for him, because it was so clear that he isn't good at thinking of illustrations. Illustrations need to be simple and to the point. And if you're going to think of an analogy, the analogy needs to make sense without requiring lengthy explanations of what different aspects of the analogy involve, or trying to fit reality to conform to the analogy. Ken Flodin reminds me of that kind of brother who you would have in a congregation who was clearly inept as a speaker, but who clearly aspired to being a great speaker, and who probably looked at some of the genuinely good speakers who could use illustrations in this very fluent, seamless way. And he'd probably watch them and think, oh, I can do that. Sure, I can think of an illustration too. And then he'd come out with this long, tedious illustration on the platform that just didn't fit at all. And again, you just feel sorry for him because he was trying too hard. That's the kind of individual that Ken Flodin reminds me of. And what's interesting about his glass-blowing analogy is, first of all, as you're watching these clips of the craftsman making the glass, you're not thinking, oh, they're making something terrible. How dare they create such an awful thing? They're making something that's beautiful. So this process that is being explored at length by Ken Flodin, with all this talk of evil air being blown down a tube, it's creating something that's nice. So it's difficult to make sense of the analogy in terms of the negative spin that Ken Flodin is putting on it. And it's also interesting that the whole point is to persuade witnesses that Satan's world is in the business of manipulating people, when what's staring people like me in the face is that if anyone is manipulating anyone, it's Watchtower manipulating the millions of Jehovah's Witnesses who will be tuning into this broadcast. They literally produce on a monthly basis these hour-long propaganda shows with segment after segment designed to pull on people's heartstrings, to persuade them to bypass logic and to persuade them to obey Watchtower no matter what. It's Watchtower that's doing the manipulating here. And yet here we have Ken Flodin pointing the finger elsewhere, saying, oh no, it's Satan's system of things that's trying to manipulate you. We wouldn't dream of doing that ourselves.
The first is harmful peer pressure. Now, often this is just an apprentice in Satan's shop. Maybe fellow students in school, fellow workers on the job. Don't you think Satan will try to capitalize on these circumstantial relationships? Absolutely. Peer pressure. It can have an influence on our mind.
Yes, it can have an influence on our mind. And what's interesting for me is that Ken Flodin opens this part by talking about harmful peer pressure. And that's quite interesting because it's almost an acknowledgement that there's harmful peer pressure and there's positive peer pressure. Because let's face it, what Watchtower does routinely is pressure Jehovah's Witnesses, and not just pressure Jehovah's Witnesses directly, but encourage Jehovah's Witnesses to pressure each other, to set an example, to others in the congregation. So it's not peer pressure by itself that Watchtower has a problem with, because they use it themselves all the time. It's only harmful peer pressure that they have a problem with, namely influences that come from pretty much anywhere else other than the organization.
They may make fun of our wholesome morals, our clean speech, our dignified dress. That is pressure. Possibly they invite us to do things that we know will lead to no good. They are twirling us with their thinking, with their taunts, or maybe with their flattery and temptation. They are rolling things over and over in our mind.
Again, Ken Flodin is pointing one finger where two fingers can be pointed straight back. Because if anyone's doing the manipulating, as far as I'm concerned, it's Watchtower. Yes, you're going to get scenarios in life, whether you're a young person or whether you're an adult, where people are trying to persuade you to do certain things. Maybe they're trying to sell you something. Maybe they are encouraging some new medication that they've stumbled on. But it's for us as adults to negotiate our way through those things. And some things that are recommended will be positive for us. But when it comes to Watchtower, they have this big long list of things that they forbid their followers. So if you're a young person, there's certain clothes you're not allowed to wear. There's certain entertainment you're not allowed to watch. There's higher education, which is forbidden for you. That's pressure from Watchtower, especially when there's the stigma associated with indulging in those things and the judgment that comes from other members of the congregation. That's real pressure. And yet, again, it seems to be Satan's system of things that's solely responsible for manipulating people in this way.
Turn to 2 Peter 2:18 and 19. And as you read this, can you pick out a word that's equivalent to peer pressure? Let's read 2 Peter 2:18 and 19. They make high-sounding statements that are empty, like air. By appealing to the desires of the flesh and with acts of brazen conduct, they entice. That's peer pressure. They entice people who have just escaped from those who live in error. While they are promising them freedom, they themselves are slaves of corruption. For if anyone is overcome by someone, he is his slave. The verse says if we're overcome by peer pressure, enticed, we actually become a slave of that person. That is scary. It's dangerous.
It's very dangerous. And yet, again, that's exactly what Watchtower is doing. Jehovah's Witnesses don't know it, but they are puppets to Watchtower. They are under Watchtower's control. And I actually like that verse that's quoted from 2 Peter 2, verse 19, where it says, "For if anyone is overcome by someone, he is his slave." Jehovah's Witnesses, whether they will know it or not, and obviously they don't know it, but they've been overcome by Watchtower using a systematic control of their thinking process. And this has actually been codified by Stephen Hassan. He came up with what's called the BITE model. BITE stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotion. If you can control people's behavior, if you can control the information that they have access to, if you can control people's thinking, and if you can control their emotional responses to things, then you can control that person. It's a scary thought to think that sentient humans can basically, under the right circumstances, be reduced to machines that can be controlled and manipulated by the whims of charismatic individuals or cult-like groups. But that's exactly what is happening with Jehovah's Witnesses, and you only need to look at other similar groups and compare the amount of control and the amount of fear in those groups to see that that's exactly what's happening in the Jehovah's Witness religion.
But what is another way that the spirit of this system can shape our thinking? You recall the apprentice passed the glass-blowing tube to the gaffer, who blew air into the glass, giving it shape. What does Satan and this system next use to mold our thinking? Enticing advertisements. Like the air of a glassblower, advertisements often have little substance. For example, that product we decided to buy when we last went shopping. Maybe it was a brand of clothing or a brand of dry cereal we bought for breakfast. Is that always purely a personal, rational decision on our part? Or did advertising subtly but powerfully affect our choice? Now, it's not that all advertising is bad or misleading, but the more we allow ourselves to be influenced by it, the more we are in danger of being led into a materialistic way of life. For example, instead of dry cereal, are we now influenced to buy that flashy-looking sports car?
This, by the way, is the slippery slope fallacy. So Ken Flodin is arguing that if you've been manipulated by advertising to buy a box of cereal, therefore you must also be prone to buying a more expensive item like a sports car. And a Jehovah's Witness watching this might be nodding along thinking, he's got a point. I was manipulated by advertising to buy this particular cereal, so maybe that means I'm also prone to buying a sports car, and maybe that makes me a bad person. You cannot underestimate how paranoid some witnesses will be and how prone they will be to this kind of flawed argumentation.
This system inflates our thinking by means of things.
What? This system inflates our thinking by means of things. This is a clip from when he's introducing a verse that he's about to read, and I won't bore you with the verse. I've checked it. It doesn't really make sense even when you look at the verse. But I feel probably some of you may be thinking I was unkind about Ken Flodin when I was saying that he's a useless teacher. But, I submit Exhibit A. He's just said the words, this system inflates our thinking by means of things. What does that sentence even mean? Inflate someone's thinking in what way? By making them better thinkers? By inflating their ego? It's just not clear. He's not a clear, coherent speaker, and yet here he is presenting Watchtower's flagship propaganda show.
Why do we need to resist catering to advertisements that feed the spirit of the world? Verse 17. Furthermore, the world is passing away, and so is its desire. But the one who does the will of God remains forever.
And of course, Watchtower gets to decide who is doing the will of God and who therefore will remain forever. Who gets to survive Armageddon, the destruction of everyone who isn't a Jehovah's Witness.
Remember Eve. Satan advertised the forbidden fruit. The scripture says it was desirable to the eyes. The tree was pleasing to look at. She succumbed to the advertisement with disastrous results. Similarly, Satan used advertisements to try to reshape Jesus' focus. Matthew chapter 4 says that Satan showed him all the kingdoms of the world, offering them in exchange for one act of worship.
Which, incidentally, is something that Satan could only do on a flat earth.
Jesus simply turned him off. Don't be overly influenced by advertisements.
Not so subtly, Jehovah's Witnesses are here being told to literally turn off their TVs if they feel they are being manipulated by advertising. And to affirm this, they are given the example of Eve having the forbidden fruit advertised by Satan, and Jesus having all of the kingdoms of the world advertised to him in the wilderness by Satan. These are examples of person A or entity A trying to influence entity B. And you can have positive influence and you can have negative influence. Advertising in and of itself is entirely harmless. It all depends on what it is that's being advertised. And if you look again at what Watchtower has been advertising for the past 130 years, you have to objectively conclude that it's a fake product that eats into people's lives, deprives them of years or even decades, and can even splinter families and potentially even lead to loss of life.
But what's the next aspect of this system that can distort our minds? Bad associations. It is as if the gaffer has now passed the glass-blowing tube to the stem maker. He takes another gather of molten glass and attaches it to our globe. Then he stretches that associated blob into the form of a stem. Well, we already talked about peer pressure, but that often comes from those who are not necessarily our close associates. What we're discussing now is our decisions about whom we spend a lot of time with. People who don't love Jehovah can stretch and misshape our minds, providing a stem or a handle for the world to hold us by.
So it goes without saying that at this point, Watchtower is again indulging in manipulating witnesses through fear and paranoia to distrust anyone who is labelled a bad association. If someone isn't living up to what Watchtower's requirements are, especially if it's someone who is worldly, someone who is outside of the organisation, these are bad associations who spoil useful habits and they must be avoided at all costs. If you're watching this as someone who knows nothing about the organisation and is just interested in learning more about Jehovah's Witnesses, this alone should be an interesting window into the level of control that witnesses are subjected to. But I just want to again dwell on how bad this illustration is, because he's talking about this sequential process where this air is blown into this glass bubble, and this is talking about advertising, and then it's passed on to to another process, which is then likened to bad association. The analogy doesn't work because people are being influenced by advertising at the same time as they're mixing with so-called bad association. It isn't a case of, well, this happens and then this happens, as you would have in the process of a glass being made. Both things are happening at the same time. So the analogy doesn't fit from that perspective. But it's also just cringeworthy to see how Ken Flodin is desperately trying to force his analogy to fit in with what he's talking about, to the extent where he says, oh, well, it's like the guy's passing the glass on to his apprentice. We can call the apprentice bad association. And we know it's bad association because it forms a handle to hold the glass. And that's like the bad association is giving a handle for the world to hold witnesses by.
People who don't love Jehovah can stretch and misshape our minds, providing a stem or a handle for the world to hold us by.
I'm not kidding. That's basically his reasoning. He is falling over himself to try and make this half-baked analogy somehow fit to all of the points he needs to talk about. He basically needs to warn witnesses against being influenced by anything that isn't the organisation. And he could just do that. He could just talk about, oh, well, brothers, we need to warn you about advertising. We need to warn you about bad association. We wouldn't want to be manipulated by Satan, would we? He could make those points perfectly well without self-indulgent, basically, without indulging in this ridiculous exercise in trying to fit the glassmaking process to the process of Satan shaping the minds of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Sometimes we hear the phrase that some of the kids in school are nicer than some of the kids in the congregation. But usually nicer actually means more fun rather than more wholesome.
No, Ken, that's just you projecting your small-minded judgmentalism and negativity on school kids that you've never met. He's literally saying that it's impossible for a so-called worldly school kid to be nicer than a Jehovah's Witness, because nicer probably just means that they're more fun and therefore more likely to lead wholesome Jehovah's Witness children astray. It couldn't possibly mean that they are literally kinder, or at least as kind as ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses. It's inconceivable in his small mind that you could be a good person or even a good school child and not be a Jehovah's Witness. And you can bet that Jehovah's Witness families will be watching this broadcast with the children there, and there will be Jehovah's Witness parents turning to their children and saying, see, it's impossible for you to have friends at school who are as nice or nicer than the children at the Hull, because Brother Flodin has just said it, so it must be true.
But let's look at 1 Corinthians 15:33 in its context.
Oh, so now we're looking at verses in context, are we?
Do not be misled. Bad associations spoil useful habits. Well, what made these ones bad association? Let's see it in context. Look at 1 Corinthians 15:12. Now, if it is being preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how is it that some among you say there is no resurrection of the dead? Well, what was the initial problem with these associates? They did not believe the same way. Well, why would that make them bad associations? Because what an associate believes will eventually affect our thinking, and our thinking affects our behavior.
Just because you have a friend who has an idea, that doesn't mean that you will automatically accept his idea. Just because he lives his life a certain way doesn't mean you will live your life that way. And yet that's the logic. That's the kind of flawed reasoning that Ken Flodin, a member of the governing body's teaching committee, is appealing to. It just simply isn't true that just because you know someone or you are associated with someone who has certain ideas, that you will automatically embrace those ideas. If your ideas can stand up to scrutiny, then you're going to hold on to them no matter what everyone else around you thinks. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's interesting that now we've looked at the context of the verse about bad association, which is obviously something that we weren't allowed to do with Romans 9, we learn that these bad associates that Paul was talking about were people who didn't believe that Christ had been raised from the dead. In other words, they were apostates. But isn't it interesting that this verse about bad associations in 1 Corinthians is repeatedly used by Watchtower? It's one of their go-to verses, and they apply it to almost everything, including members of the congregation, actual believing Jehovah's Witnesses, who are just not quite doing things the way they would like. They are classed as bad associations. Well, you would see them at the meetings, but you wouldn't want to invite them round to your home because you get to decide, no, they're bad associations. So you can get to basically shun them even though they are fellow believers. That's the way this verse is routinely applied by Watchtower. And yet when you read the verse in context, it's actually talking about apostasy.
May all of us avoid bad association, whether in person, on TV, or on the internet.
Whatever you do, Jehovah's Witnesses, make sure you stay off the internet, because we wouldn't want you knowing all about reality.
What's a fourth means by which Satan attempts to fashion us, reshaping our thinking? Higher education. Most of us remember the January 2015 JW Broadcasting program hosted by Brother Morris of the governing body.
Yes, who could forget about Tony Morris's rant about the evils of higher education?
It is one thing to work on a job with others and quite another matter to immerse oneself in an institution of learning. Higher learning can easily influence thinking and attitudes. I have long said, the better the university, the greater the danger. The most intelligent and eloquent professors will be trying to reshape the thinking of your child, and their influence can be tremendous. Here, Jehovah guarantees that one day, every person on earth will be a true worshiper of Him. Will you be there? Will your son or daughter be among those alive at that time?
Incredibly, Watchtower is actually proud of material that stigmatizes higher education, that manipulates young Jehovah's Witnesses into thinking there is something evil about furthering your education and developing your potential and making something of yourself. But I also just find it fascinating that a talk by Tony Morris, a governing body member, is being cited and referred to almost in the same breath as the Bible itself. It's almost like the words of the mighty, faithful, and discreet slave are now almost on a par with the words of Jehovah.
He focused on the value of divine education, but he also reaffirmed the dangers of pursuing higher secular education. Its whole purpose is for learning, influencing one's thinking. And while a person's intention might be just to create a stable base for a secular future, his decision could expose him to unscriptural ideas and practices.
Its whole purpose is for learning and influencing one's thinking. First of all, when was learning bad? When did it become bad for Jehovah's Witnesses to learn stuff? And secondly, as for influencing one's thinking, what is this entire JW broadcasting circus all about? It's all about influencing people. It's all about manipulating and coercing millions of Jehovah's Witnesses to give their lives over to Watchtower and to be obedient to Watchtower in every facet of their lives. The real reason why Watchtower is terrified of higher education is because the governing body know that by going to college and university, young Jehovah's Witnesses will sharpen their critical thinking skills. They will learn things that contradict their indoctrination. They will learn that this bubble that they've been raised in is not reality. It's an artificial, man-made construct in which they are purely pawns of a human-led organization. By going to college and mingling with free minds and learning how to think, learning how to process information, learning how to verify things as factual or unfactual, it's almost inevitable that the majority will conclude that they have been raised in a cult. That's why Watchtower doesn't want young people going to college and university. It's an entirely selfish reason. They want to perpetuate their organization at the expense of the potential and future of young people.
Recall that another gather of hot glass is added to the end of the stem. The craftsman then rolls the tube backward and forward. He forms the base for the glass. Well, we will say no more about this topic other than what Brother Morris has already shared. You might want to go back and review that broadcast. However, we would like to read 1 Timothy 6:20 and 21. Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you. That's divine education. Turning away from the empty speeches that violate what is holy and from the contradictions of the falsely called knowledge. By making a show of such knowledge, some have deviated from the faith. Unfortunately, in an effort to make a stable base for one's financial future, many have deviated from the faith.
Why wouldn't you, as a young Jehovah's Witness, who suddenly got all these tools to be able to think for yourself, to be able to process information, to be able to see the world as it truly is, why wouldn't you get the heck out of there at the earliest opportunity, rather than waste the rest of your life basically living a pretense just to satisfy those around you, even though you've learned, you're genuinely convinced of the fact that it's not true. It's just not true. And why would you want to waste your life on something that's not true?
In the visuals of a glass-blowing shop, we observed the skill of the workers involved. And that shop obviously produces beautiful, useful glass vessels. Satan's glass shop is also skilled at shaping one's thinking. But what does it produce? Instead of a person becoming a valuable vessel that Jehovah can use, Satan is actually mass-producing worthless vessels that Jehovah cannot use. What could you do with this misshaped creation? Nothing. It is useless. At the outset, Romans 9:22 was quoted. Those who conform to Satan's system are referred to as vessels of wrath, made fit for destruction. Jehovah has paid a high price for us. Gold and glass cannot be compared to it. May we make over our minds by applying godly wisdom. Glorify Jehovah as a vessel that he can use.
So, where to begin? I think it's very obvious. Well, first of all, let's talk about the illustration, because I told you at the beginning that what Ken Flodin is doing here is coming up with this ridiculous, convoluted analogy that isn't even based on a proper scriptural footing. And he basically has to admit that a glassblower's workshop is not making worthless things. It's making beautiful, useful things. Well, there you go. You cannot therefore use the analogy. How do you use an analogy of a group of people who are making something that's both useful and beautiful, and making it with great skill and care, and twist it so that they're actually exerting all of that time and effort to make something that's worthless and make something that's useless? There's no reason why glassblowers would make that glass unless it was for some kind of artistic value, some kind of art project. They just wouldn't make it. So again, Ken Flodin's illustration just doesn't work, because if you're going to choose an analogy, make it something realistic, make it something that people can relate to. No one can relate to a glassblower's workshop where people invest all of this time and energy in making things that can't be either used or enjoyed. And then you have this bizarre piece of theatre where Ken Flodin smashes this misshapen glass, let's call it. And I found that quite disturbing, because it's almost as though his anger and his hatred is tangible. You could almost imagine him let's face it, that glass represents a person. He's spent all of this time explaining how people can be manipulated into worthless vessels. So what he's doing there is he's destroying a person that Watchtower has deemed unworthy and unsuitable and destined for annihilation. And just the coldness on his face and the anger. And bear in mind, this sort of barely concealed aggression is a recurring theme for him. Back in 2016, Ken Flodin is throwing a piece of bread in a bin, declaring it as someone who has been discarded by Jehovah as a piece of garbage.
Jehovah discards the person like a piece of garbage.
2 years later, he's smashing a glass, pretending it's someone who's been misled by Satan.
Vessels of wrath made fit for destruction.
This man is clearly seething with hatred for anyone who doesn't share his devotion to Jehovah's organization, and he relishes their annihilation, or at least he has repeatedly visualized their annihilation. And lest we forget, Ken Flodin is on the teaching committee of the governing body, which is responsible for the material that's presented to Jehovah's Witnesses at their annual conventions. With this kind of judgmentalism masterminding the convention talks and videos, is it any wonder that they are brimming with hatred and loathing for anyone who fails to live up to Watchtower's expectations?
How can we choose entertainment that will enhance and not taint our sacrifice to Jehovah? In the following dramatization, notice how a fellow Christian helps a young brother to make better choices.
So Danny, you're obviously good at biking. What else do you like to do for fun?
Soon, I was showing him my video games. And surprisingly, he liked video games too. But he said he chose to be selective.
And what we mean by selective is basically he's very careful not to play any video games that Watchtower would disapprove of, which is essentially the point of this segment. We're being treated to a dramatization where a boy named Danny, who plays violent video games, learns that he is basically to stop doing this.
He began to describe the gladiators in ancient Rome. People would come from all over to watch them fight to the death. And while the spectators weren't in any physical danger, the real danger came over time. Repeatedly watching the bloodshed and the killing, it was dulling their senses, and they wanted more of it. This was a big test for the Christians who lived back then. Akil helped me to reason on the scripture at Romans 12, verse 9. Abhor what is wicked, cling to what is good.
So Danny, the games may have changed over time, but the violence is still the same. I like video games, but I avoid the ones that promote what Jehovah hates.
Okay, so first of all, let me just say that I personally am not into playing video games. Occasionally I'll play like a karting game or something like that. But for the most part, I know that if I start getting seriously into playing video games, they're just going to consume all my time, and my time is already at a premium, and I feel like I don't have any to waste, basically. But I certainly don't hold it against anyone who does play video games, even violent video games. And I mean, here's the thing. The video makes some good points that you could potentially become desensitized to violence if you play violent video games. And I can kind of understand that. But first of all, there's clearly a difference between the Roman gladiatorial games and pretending you're a soldier in a simulated reality, because the Roman gladiatorial games were real. There were real people dying. You were really experiencing death. That's not happening in a simulated environment. So it's a false comparison. And also, quite frankly, I think this is the sort of thing where people can make their own decisions. Quite clearly, not everyone who plays violent video games is going out on killing sprees or randomly approaching and assaulting people in the street. It's manifestly, it might have that effect on some people, particularly people who have mental health problems, perhaps, I don't know. But it's manifestly not having that effect on most people, which would lead me to suggest that this is one of many areas in life where the individual should have the freedom to decide for themselves what works and what doesn't work. But of course, that kind of thinking is just a no-go for Watchtower, because they absolutely insist on controlling every facet of someone's life. So that in addition to having your clothing, your dress and grooming moderated by Watchtower, you've also got to think about your entertainment, what films you watch, what video games you play. The micromanagement in the life of a Jehovah's Witness is just astonishing.
Jehovah's people can still have fun. And yeah, we can even play video games. I just want to make wise choices. I want to show Jehovah that I hate wickedness. And make his heart glad.
As we saw in this episode, our choice in entertainment can affect our worship. We could be exposing ourselves to Satan's thinking. If you're enticed by entertainment that displeases Jehovah, what Bible principles will help you? Chapter 6 of the God's Love book features a box entitled, "What Entertainment Should I Choose?" Make the scriptures in this feature a matter of prayer and discussion in family worship. They will help you cling to what is good.
So again, if you're watching this as someone who's never been a Jehovah's Witness, you're just fascinated about the life of Jehovah's Witnesses and what their religion entails, this is the level to which they're controlled. They're literally being shown a box from one of their publications that says, well, the music you listen to, what kind of lyrics are there? The movies that you go and watch, what are the storylines like? Is there violence? Same thing with video games. Is there violence in the video games? That's the level to which you're controlled as a Jehovah's Witness. And again, that's not to say that there isn't some merit in an individual considering whether certain things he's watching or taking in might be helpful to him or not helpful. That's a discussion to be had, but not on pain of death. Not by saying you need to do what we're telling you to do and you need to avoid all of these things or you'll be destroyed at Armageddon. That's a very unhealthy way of approaching these issues. And again, what it amounts to is an organization imposing itself on an individual's choices and making sure that person knows who's in charge.
But at times, clinging to the good includes receiving discipline, which can be painful. How can we look beyond any pain to the benefits of divine correction? At a Bethel morning worship, Brother Anthony Morris, a member of the governing body, discussed how a proper view of discipline brings us closer to Jehovah.
How might we reject the discipline of Jehovah? Well, put yourself in a position You're being counseled. It's come to the point where overseers, elders have had to sit down with you. Now, some, as soon as the counsel begins to flow, there's this quickness to be upset, to justify, to feel picked on. Well, Jehovah's saying, don't reject this. And if they're using the scriptures and thoughts from publications, view it as coming from Jehovah so that we can stay close to him.
I never fail to be astonished by this man's arrogance and detachment from reality. We're talking here about discipline, which can involve, of course, judicial committees, people who are dragged before this 3-elder kangaroo court, where 3 men get to play judge, jury, and executioner, have the power to separate families, have the power to just deliver unimaginable suffering on people through estrangement and ostracism. And apparently it's wrong, even under those circumstances, to defend oneself, to question judgment, to question discipline, to say, well, maybe guys, maybe you've got the wrong end of the stick here. Maybe I've actually not done anything wrong. Or maybe if I have done something wrong, it doesn't merit this level of punishment. But in Tony Morris's warped, twisted version of reality, there can be no questioning Jehovah's authority. You've just got to take the discipline.
Now, give you an idea of sometimes reading something that will bring us close to Jehovah, especially if we veered off and didn't even realize it. I'm going to go way back to some examples of Jehovah's sheep reading something in the watchtower, and it just disciplined them so that they could get close to Jehovah. And it goes way back to 1982 and had to do with TV serials or soap operas. And someone said, well, my, that's a long time ago. Well, the fact is nothing's changed. Some of these soap operas are still on that had the names that they had in 1982. They still have it.
Yes, Tony is now going to read to us some profound wisdom that was printed in Watchtower magazines from the early 1980s on the subject of soap operas, because we all know what a pressing matter that is.
Now, after the articles came out, we had some write-in to explain what happened to them. And so months later, after this 1982 issue of the Watchtower, and that was December 1st, we went to 83 Watchtower, December 1st, and here's the response from some of the readers. And I found it very commendable. I think you'll appreciate the humility, because it takes humility to accept and have the proper view of discipline. So one of the dangers that the brothers were warned about is that you get emotionally attached to the characters in the show. So here's what one wrote. I had grown up watching this one soap opera, and the character Julie was just like my friend. One day, Julie had an accident that left her beautiful face badly scarred. I was in front of the TV set every day to make sure she was going to pull through. That night, as I was saying my prayers, before I even thought what I was saying, I prayed. And Jehovah, please bless Julie. Well, she admits I was shocked. She should have been. This plea to Jehovah for Julie had come from my heart. Realizing how involved she had become, she stopped watching these programs. She wrote, if all readers will take your article on TV serials to heart, they will feel a real sense of freedom, since our own everyday problems are enough to cope with. So you see, our sister had the proper view of discipline, and she was able to keep close to Jehovah.
So of all the things that Tony Morris, a member of the governing body, could be talking about, and it's worth acknowledging that this is a morning worship, There's a different morning worship every morning where a different topic is addressed. Nevertheless, this one has been chosen by Watchtower for the JW broadcasting episode. So this is apparently profound wisdom that we need to dwell on. And of all the things that we could be thinking about, are we going to think about how we can better protect children in our organisation? No. Are we going to think about how we can show more mercy to people who find themselves shunned or disfellowshipped? No. Let's instead talk about soap operas and people who end up taking them too seriously or become addicted to soap operas. That's the pressing matter of the day that Tony Morris is coming to the rescue to talk to us about.
So discipline is painful, but the peaceable fruit of righteousness makes it worth it to have a proper view of the discipline and to accept it humbly so we can remain close to our precious Father, Jehovah.
Discipline helps us reshape our thinking and actions, drawing us closer to our grand Creator. It may come from God's Word, publications produced by the faithful and discreet slave, a parent, or mature fellow Christians. No matter how we receive discipline, always remember what Proverbs 3:12 says. Those whom Jehovah loves, he reproves, just as a father does a son in whom he delights.
And isn't that precisely the sort of thing any narcissist could say who is keeping someone captive in an abusive relationship? Oh, I'm disciplining you because I love you. I'm hurting you for your own benefit. You should be grateful that I'm hurting you because you're better off for it. Jehovah's Witnesses, millions of Jehovah's Witnesses are getting this advice that they're never to question the judgments that come down from their leaders or from the elders. They've just got to take the discipline, whatever it is, and if they question it, if they try to defend themselves, if they say, well, this doesn't really apply to me, or maybe you're over-exaggerating, or this seems a bit extreme, brothers, well, in that case, you're not accepting the discipline properly, and it's your problem, not theirs.
When I was 18, I took up a form of karate known as Kyokushinkai. Just imagine a large number of people in kimonos standing in rows, bravely and without a shadow of fear working on improving their blows and striving to progress. I thought, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. I set the goal of reaching the next World Championships, winning a high place and immortalizing myself so that my name would remain and generations would remember me. Among those sportsmen, although I saw a lot of nice words and slogans, not everything was as pure as I'd hoped for. And then on one occasion, I was sitting down, and feelings of emptiness just wouldn't leave me alone. And for the first time in my life, I talked to God. And then I prayed, I don't understand you. Why is there so much beauty in the world? And yet so much suffering. Is that really what you want, for us to live like this? I prayed, I guess, for about 4 hours. You know, the strongest feeling of emptiness and loneliness is that of a creation without its creator. And I was so lonely at that time. And a while afterwards, there was a knock at my door. It was Jehovah's Witnesses.
If you're watching this and you've never been a Jehovah's Witness, and you're curious as to how anyone in their right mind could get themselves roped into this organization, given how controlling it is and given how little of it makes sense, well, here you go. I would just encourage you to watch this clip. This, in essence, is how people, not necessarily all the time, but certainly a lot of the time, this is how people get preyed on by the organization. It's because they are emotionally vulnerable. And what's being described here is a girl who's feeling feelings of emptiness and loneliness. And if you're in that state of mind, where you're consumed with loneliness. You need someone there to reassure you. And these people come along and say, well, we've got great news for you. All you need to do is study this book and you'll have a happy life with fulfillment, and you'll have an instant brotherhood around you, and you'll have a common goal, and you'll have a hope for the future, a perfect world to look forward to. That's when it starts to make sense. That's when it starts to be appealing.
I started studying the Bible. It was so wonderful. On one occasion, the sister who studied with me looked up at me, and when she looked at those bruises, those beaten up knuckles, she took a deep breath and shook her head. I said, "Is there something wrong?" She said, "You know, I'm in great pain." I said, "Why are you in pain?" She said, "Well, I'm looking at your hands, your elbows, your battered legs, all of that. Doesn't it hurt?" I said, "Well, yes." And she said, "You know, it hurts me to see you in pain." And I started to understand that Jehovah is the true God, that this really was the truth.
That has got to be one of the worst reasons I've ever heard as to why this is Jehovah's one true organization. And I've heard a lot of terrible, terrible reasons, but here they're seriously trying to tell us that because a Jehovah's Witness was looking at this girl's bruises and saying, "Oh, I'm in pain because I can imagine that must be very painful for you. Oh, well, that means this must be God's one true organization, because only in Jehovah's Witnesses could people have that kind of compassion for someone else." I don't know how anyone can be silly enough to reach the conclusion that only Jehovah's Witnesses are capable of feeling compassion and empathy for other people.
It was difficult. The pressure from relatives and friends was very strong. But the most difficult thing that I had to battle with was my strong attachment to karate. Just a year remained until the World Championships. I had prepared for them. I had been working toward that goal for 5 years. Glory can seem really sweet when you are the victor, when your opponents fall to the ground. So I flew to the World Championships. When I made it to the last 4 winners and I had to fight for 3rd place, I wanted to ask my trainer to stop. Why? Because I couldn't feel a single live place on my body. Everything was beaten up. But he said, "You know, we love you so much. Go for it." And at that moment, it felt as though I was weighing love, the world's love and the love of Jehovah's organization. It seemed to me that the world was saying, "We love you. Now just go and die." But the love in the organization says, "It hurts me to see you in pain." I realized that the world can't give you what it doesn't have. It doesn't know how to love.
So Gazelle, that's her name, is here talking about this tournament she was in where she made it through to the 3rd place playoff. She doesn't think she can continue. And her coach says, "We love you so much, go for it." And those words by that one individual, and you can argue, I'm sure, that this guy didn't mean what he was saying. He was just saying something to motivate Gazelle and probably didn't really feel genuine love for her. You know, I can grant you that, but how can you possibly insist that this trainer was speaking for all non-Jehovah's Witnesses so that you can say that the love of everyone who isn't a Jehovah's Witness is fake and insincere, based purely on what this one person said to another person at a karate championship? It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but that's the kind of logic that you get in these JW Broadcasting episodes. And as for this whole idea of Jehovah's Witnesses being beacons of love, I'm sorry, I'm not buying that for one moment. Because as anyone who's been involved for any length of time in this religion will tell you, the love of Jehovah's Witnesses is paper thin, and it's entirely conditional on not just being a Jehovah's Witness, but being the best Jehovah's Witness you can be, because you can quite easily find yourself experiencing some form of shunning, or having people turn their backs on you just because you've missed a few meetings or just because you're not regular on the ministry. That's how paper thin the love of this religion is, and yet they have the gall to tell us here that it's their love that marks them out as God's one true organization.
But nevertheless, I went to the fight and became the bronze medalist. And when I stood on the podium of glory, I understood that glory among people who don't love you weighs no more than emptiness. If a person dedicates his life to glorifying himself, he will always meet with disappointment and emptiness. So I made the firm decision to escape from karate. I started preaching, and I was baptized in 2005 at the summer convention in Kurgan.
Again, we have propaganda aimed at telling young people that it's wrong to pursue sports because you're glorifying yourself. Who do you think you are to think you're deserving of any recognition for individual achievement? Who do you think you are? You're nobody. Nobody gets a right to any kind of acknowledgement or recognition. And if they are interested in pursuing that, they're just being selfish and arrogant. And actually, there's only one group of men on the planet who get to seek acknowledgement and prominence, and that's the governing body. They're the only ones who get to be acknowledged or recognized, or who get to be famous in this system of things. It's sad because you just know that this is going to have an impact on someone's hopes and dreams. There's bound to be a young Jehovah's Witness who's watching this, who perhaps would have pursued sports or singing or something that would result in them receiving recognition for their achievements. Maybe there's the future Serena Williams watching this video, and the message they're receiving is, no, you're not to pursue this, because if you do, actually, you're glorifying yourself. And who do you think you are to do that? And infuriatingly, the next segment has pretty much the exact same message.
Our next segment will introduce you to young ones who resisted the pressure to conform to the world's view of success.
Right now I'm serving in the Central America branch, and I have the opportunity to work with extraordinary brothers and sisters, both here and in other parts of the world. My name is Rogelio. I'm part of the art department, and I'm a digital illustrator.
Music really means the world to me. I am Joyce. I'm a pioneer, and I sing alto in the Bethel chorus.
My name is Liu Lan, and I serve as a regular pioneer in a congregation where there's a need. I love doing that. My life is wonderful.
Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be wonderful? When you've been indoctrinated to think that the only way of being happy in life is to serve Watchtower, why aren't you going to think that your life is wonderful if you're serving Watchtower? Even if you are sacrificing future opportunities, if you're sacrificing the chance to do something with a skill that you have, with a talent that you have, and instead just focusing all of your time and energy on Watchtower and committing yourself to serving the organization for the rest of your life. What we're seeing here is history repeating itself. We started the JW Broadcasting episode with Cecil Goff, who in his final years was celebrating the fact that decades of his life have just been exhausted in service of the organization. And now we see the next generation repeating his mistake.
Ever since I was little, I've always loved playing soccer, and that was my biggest dream. My goal was to become a professional soccer player.
The truth is, setting goals was always difficult for me because I always had two passions. Am I a servant of Jehovah or an artist?
You can quite clearly be both a servant of Jehovah and a professional artist. Seriously, what is the reason why you can't make money from artwork, but you can make money from something like, I don't know, being a salesman or working in a retail store or some other means of generating income. What's so different about art other than the fact that if you do it well enough, you could get some kind of recognition or fame? And you also saw football referred to, or soccer as you Americans call it. This is personal for me because I'm a huge football fan and I enjoy playing the sport. And it's always irritated me, this attitude that Watchtower has, that you're allowed to play football, you're allowed to try and score goals against another team, so long as it's purely for exercise and purely for recreation. The minute things start to get competitive, which by the way is when things start to get interesting and you genuinely start to enjoy it, is when there's some competition involved, when there's something at stake, when there's something to play for, that's when it gets enjoyable. Oh no, we need to scale back. It has to be just about running around with a ball and getting some exercise and laughing and joking with friends. That's the only form of football that people like Ken Flodin and people in Watchtower's kind of hierarchy, that's the only form of football they approve of. And we're going to see in this segment this guy from Mexico talking about how, despite having the opportunity to be a professional footballer, to make a living from doing something that he loves, he's turned his back on that because, again, it's something where it's possible to make a name for yourself and receive acknowledgement and recognition and accolades. And again, there's only one group of men on the planet who are entitled to those things.
My goal was to become the best gymnast in the world. At that moment, gymnastics were number one in my life.
If you're good at gymnastics and you want to be a professional gymnast, why are you going to not want to win? Why are you going to say, right, I'm going to be a professional gymnast, I just don't want to be the top gymnast. I don't want to be the best gymnast. I want to be the second or third or fourth best gymnast. That will do for me. What professional gymnast is going to say that? Either gymnastics is wrong or it isn't. It seems to me to be perfectly innocent to pursue a career as a personal gymnast, and the only reason I can think of why Watchtower would object to it is because there's a chance that if you're very good at it, you'll get famous.
I played at big festivals, standing ovations. That was amazing. I was surrounded by non-witnesses, using drugs, smoking, swearing.
That is not a reason to give up being a professional singer. You make money for singing. That's your job. It's what you do to earn an income. In almost any form of employment, unless you work at a JW-only company, and those things do exist, but the vast majority of JWs who are employed, I would argue, are surrounded by worldly people who do and say things that Watchtower would find objectionable. Why is it so different if you're a worldly singer and you're in contact with people in that situation who are worldly? Why the different rule for them? Again, it seems quite obvious to me that the problem with singing is the same as the problem with being an artist, or the problem with being a footballer, or the problem with being a gymnast. If you get sufficiently good at it, there's a likelihood that you'll get famous.
My trainer had mapped out a complete training program with the Olympics as a goal. This would make me feel trapped.
No, you're just not trapped. You are not trapped. Your trainer is obviously going to map out a training program if you want to succeed, if you want to be the best. And as I've already said, why would you want to be a mediocre professional gymnast? What you are definitely trapped in is a group that literally threatens you with being ostracized and estranged from all of your believing family members and friends if you ever dare to question the authority of the leadership. Just don't talk to me about being trapped in a career as a professional gymnast.
I started thinking, what do I want to do with my life? More importantly, what does Jehovah want?
When I was studying design, I was already a regular pioneer. It wasn't easy for me to come to the understanding that the one who really matters is Jehovah.
When I was 16 years old, different teams started offering me high-paying contracts. I felt a lot of pressure, and it was a temptation because they would constantly call me and come to my house. I noticed that when the players played the sport, they were happy, but afterwards, they weren't.
Again, you're giving a reason why this particular profession is awful that could be applied to almost any other profession. Since when was it relevant whether people are happy or not after they've finished doing their job? I can imagine lots of jobs where people are unhappy both during the job and after they've finished the job. But apparently, because this guy noticed that after the game had finished, some players were unhappy. Well, that means that this is not the thing for me. It's right for me to turn down the opportunity to be a professional footballer, because any career I choose needs to meet this invented standard that I've created, that there needs to be happiness. I need to be happy after I've finished doing it. This is just nonsense. Quite clearly, Watchtower is just clutching at straws, trying to find reasons why these professions are bad, and they're coming up with stuff that makes no sense at all, in this case happiness, when the real reason why they don't want people to be professional footballers is, again, because they don't want people to be in with a shot of having fame and recognition. That's what they're terrified of. It's totally selfish, and it amounts to putting the needs of Watchtower and the ego of the governing body above the needs and aspirations of young people.
I felt a little guilty when I thought of how much of myself I was giving to design and art and all of that. So that's when I made my decision. I decided to leave university and focus on my service.
Well, there you have it, folks. Apparently, if you're studying art in college or university, you need to quit your course and devote your life to serving Watchtower, because it's just wrong to make your living from drawing or painting. You can make your living by doing things that don't offer the possibility of becoming famous, but anything where there's the remotest chance that you'll get recognition or fame, no, you should walk away from it, because it's clearly a temptation from Satan.
I realised that for a long time, I hadn't been growing spiritually. I prayed intensely to Jehovah. I asked, do I know you? Do I live the way you would want? And after that, I stopped performing with non-witnesses.
What is the difference between performing as a singer with non-witnesses and stacking supermarket shelves with non-witnesses? Seriously, I would love to know.
I prayed to Jehovah. And then, at the convention, we received a DVD young people ask, what will I do with my life? That really was Jehovah's answer to my prayers. In the Bible it says that the truth will set you free. That freedom is something I never used to feel.
And let me guess, you feel that freedom now, even though you've literally given up on your dream of becoming a professional gymnast in favour of devoting your life to an organisation that literally tells people that they deserve to be shunned and ostracised if they ever question the leadership. This is the freedom that you're so proud of.
To wake up each day knowing that I'm going to do something new for Jehovah is extraordinary. It's an unbelievable blessing. It's like living a dream. I feel that I belong to a global organization and we are all going in the same direction. It's something really wonderful for me.
Seriously, I try not to use the word cult too much in my videos because I realise what a huge turn-off it is. But this guy who has given up on being a professional artist to create the illustrations for Watchtower propaganda is here talking about the fact that he's now part of a global organisation. And it's all great because he's doing meaningful work for this organisation on a daily basis, and we're all united and we're all in this together. What cult couldn't say that. Name me one cult, and obviously they're all different sizes. They all have completely different belief systems, or usually very different belief systems. But there's nothing to be proud of about being part of a collective. That's exactly the same thing that you could say if you're a member of the Sea Org for Scientology. There is nothing unique here. If anything, it's just reaffirming the fact that these people are being exploited.
To sing for Jehovah is the most beautiful privilege I could ever imagine. One of the biggest blessings is that I have a real friendship with Jehovah. Friendship with my brothers and sisters, young or old, it doesn't matter.
Brothers and sisters who will drop you in an instant if you ever start questioning your beliefs.
To continue to be among Jehovah's people, that's the joy I was looking for, and I found it.
The world tries to pass off the thrill of recognition or fame as fulfillment, but do not be deceived. These fine examples show that doing your best for Jehovah leads to real contentment. His smile of approval is worth more than any accolade this system of things could ever bestow.
Finally, we get something approaching honesty on this matter from Ken Flodin. He's talking there about the thrill of recognition or fame. And that's really the only thing that sets these particular professions apart from any other profession. If you're a professional gymnast, if you're a professional artist, if you're a professional singer, if you're a professional football player, there's the possibility that if you're good enough at it, you will get recognition or fame. It's not bad. There's nothing in the Bible against being well known for doing something good, doing something that lots of people are going to enjoy. How can you make rules about this? How can you tell young people? How can you enforce your opinions on young people's lives in this way when it's a matter on which the Bible is silent?
It's hard to see clear when challenges appear. We get lost inside the emotions we feel. When adversity strikes us down, no need to stay on the ground, look up.
So yes, we're now in this month's music video, the moment you've all been waiting for. And just to talk you through what's happening here, there's two characters in this. There's the father and there's the son. We've just seen the father, who's a hotel worker, and he picks up a tab from a poster that seems to be advertising some kind of get-rich-quick scheme or something like that. He sees a guy in a flash car and he's envious of that lifestyle. And later on in the music video, we see him calling at an elder's house, or apparently an elder's house, and receiving some scriptural wisdom to stop being so obsessed with materialism. That's what we're seeing here. We're seeing propaganda intended to guilt trip Jehovah's Witnesses, and they're being shown this stereotype of this rich guy pulling up in his convertible outside a luxury hotel, as if to say, how dare you try to make something of yourself? How dare you aspire to being successful?
Do not be afraid, for he is with us, saving us with his right hand of righteousness. So when it gets hard sometimes, we need to remember we're not alone. No, we're never alone. Just pray, do not be afraid.
So now it's the son's turn, and as you can probably guess, the whole point of this part of the music video is to emphasize the perils of joining a sports team.
We need to remember we're not just pray. So when those dark clouds come rolling in, hold your head high, it'll be alright. Do not be afraid, for he is with us, saving us with his right hand of righteousness.
This is just so transparently manipulative and coercive. I'm almost grateful to Watchtower for making it, because although this will have a negative impact, I'm sure, on lots of young witnesses, especially those who aspire to being footballers, anyone who watches this who isn't a Jehovah's Witness can immediately see, hopefully, what's happening here. Again, it's been established by Ken Flodin that the real reason why Watchtower doesn't like people becoming, joining football teams, or especially becoming professional footballers, is because it's terrified of them getting recognition or fame. Same thing with singing, same thing with being an artist, etc. And again, because they know that that's not a good enough reason, because there's nothing in the Bible about lots of people appreciating what you do professionally, they need to come up with some other reason. And so you see the young lad getting ready to come on the field with two guys by his side, and one lad is trying to show him something on his phone. Again, there's got to be some subtext, there's got to be some insinuation that worldly people are evil, and oh look, they're trying to thrust something questionable, something that Jehovah's Witnesses would disapprove of in this young man's face. So that's why football's wrong, because he's surrounded by worldly people. And again, you cannot make that argument, you cannot base your argument on the fact that you're surrounded by worldly people if you're surrounded by worldly people in an office or working at the supermarket or in almost any other form of profession. I guess although I'm glad that this will be obvious to many who are watching this, at the same time I'm raging inside, because that young kid was me. I once aspired to being a footballer as a teenager, and obviously I didn't become a footballer, and I doubt I ever would have been good enough, even if I'd have given it all my time and dedication. But why take young people's dreams away? Why deprive them of something? If they're really good at it, why can't they pursue it? Why can't they be recognized for it? Why can't they be famous? If they're good at it, why not? I don't see how Watchtower has the right to impose itself in that way. I think it's really, it's hypocritical, given the fact that, again, apparently there's nothing wrong with the governing body being famous. But if it's an ordinary Jehovah's Witness, if it's a rank and file publisher, no, absolutely not. So that's pretty much all I've got for you in this month's rebuttal. I think the main takeaway, apart from Watchtower continuing its bizarre and damaging crusade against higher education and trying to impose itself on the dreams and aspirations of young people, is Ken Flodin's kind of disturbing talk, in which he showcased his terrible teaching skills with this bizarre convoluted illustration that had no sound scriptural basis. And I found it fascinating the way he was kind of very clearly trying to disguise the fact that the verse in Romans 9 didn't apply to his whole idea of Satan creating vessels of wrath. I found that fascinating. And again, we're talking about an individual, Ken Flodin, who is right up there in the governing body's committees, pulling the strings and imposing his twisted views and his kind of judgmental, narrow-minded opinions on official Watchtower teachings. And it's no surprise to me that year after year we're getting this disturbing material being presented at the conventions if you have someone like Ken Flodin on the teaching committee deciding on what the nature of the videos and talks are going to be. But that's pretty much everything I've got for you. I hope you have enjoyed this rebuttal. Please don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more videos, and as always, thank you for watching.